WSRE presents Food for Thought, in-depth presentations on political, social, scientific, and cultural topics. In April of 2010, archaeologist Norma spoke on defining Pensacola and Fort Walton cultures in the western Florida Panhandle during the period of 1100 to 1763 AD. Her presentation was made possible by a grant from the Florida Humanities Council. It was recorded at the Heritage Museum of Northwest Florida in Valparaiso.
I'd like to thank the Humanities Council for the nice grant you guys got. It's a good job doing that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, just give you an introduction to some of the Indians in Northwest Florida. And then I'm specifically going to talk about a time period that archaeologists call Fort Walton and Pensacola. It refers to a type of culture. People use the bays and the oceans like we do. It's a little bit hard to define even for archaeologists, and so that's another reason that I wanted to talk to you about it. But it does include some research from Choctawhatchee Bay, from St. Andrew Bay in Panama City, and also from Pensacola. And so let me give you a little bit of background first there. About 10 or 12,000 years ago, the Indians of Northwest Florida first show up archaeologically. And the only thing we really find from those sites that old, and around here there aren't very many that old, but the only thing we really find are stone tools. And they didn't make pottery, and so it was such a long time ago that the preservation for the artifacts that they did make sometimes is pretty bad. They used a lot of bone tools. They would have used a lot of wooden tools and a lot of points of nice rock that doesn't come from anywhere around here. They had to import all of that. So they had a very well-established trade network by about 8,000 BC or so. Here's some from a little later in time. They started to make them differently. They started to make spear points a little bit differently. By this time, also out of different materials. Now, some of these materials come all the way from up in Georgia and Alabama in the areas around Atlanta, Birmingham, north of Montgomery especially. And they were doing a couple of things with these that makes them look different than the earlier ones. One of these is they were using them as spear points for something called an atlatl, which is basically a spear thrower. And it increased the range of their spears, also increased the power behind the spears. It's like a giant lever, basically. And so we start to find a lot more of those around here in this time period, a lot more of these points, which means normally that the population is growing. You find more artifacts, then you can bet that more people were there. Sometimes it means that there was better access to the materials that they're looking for. Now, a lot of you may have sites in your own backyard and might not even know it. And this is about as subtle a site as you can see from the surface here. But the white area that you see there is actually oyster shell scattered about. And a lot of people think when they see these at the edge of the bay or in their yards that these are natural oyster formations, and so that at one point that was underwater. They may have been underwater at some point, but more than likely these were Indian trash piles, and we call them middens. And it's the refuse, what they left behind when they were eating. Now, it can be scattered across the top of the land surface like that, pretty thin, or it can be thick like this, and that is about 3 feet thick, and it is nothing but pure shell and fish bone. The shell is what preserves really well. The oyster shell preserves really well, but one of the things that they were doing is eating a lot more fish than they were oyster. And when we do some detailed analysis of a site like this in what we call a shell midden, we do find a lot of fish bone. We also find other bones too, like deer in particular, raccoon, and some other small mammals. But we do find a lot of fish bones, so they certainly were eating a lot of fish around here. This circle that you see here is looking down on something that we call a shell ring. And some of them can be very small and very subtle, only rise up just half a foot or so above the surface of the ground, shaped like big donuts there. The people were disposing of refuse in this pattern. This area in the middle here, though, was kept clean. That was a ceremonial area of some sort. So with these sorts of shell rings, there was nothing going on there in the middle every day. They wanted to do something special in there, so they kept it swept clean. Sort of like sweeping out the church, you don't want a bunch of dirt in the church. Now, some of them are very small. We have them all over Florida, and then some of them are very large. This one that you see here is on the Georgia coast, and it is a huge donut like this, and it's got a cut through the middle of it where there was some excavation in the 50s. It's 12 feet tall. This is 12 feet of shell that you see through there. Obviously, that didn't happen overnight. They came back year after year after year, sometimes hundreds of years. And at this particular site, we do see that because we see at the bottom down here, when they were doing excavations, they didn't find any pottery. So it was before Indians started making pottery, about 2,500, 3,000 years ago. After that, 5,000 years ago. After that, you start to see pottery in the upper levels, and then it's plain. It's very, very plain. Then you see decorated pottery in the middle of this thing, and as you go up, you start to see more and more in the way of decorations, also more pottery. And so we can get some idea of the time span that these people were coming back and forth here. And these are some of the tools that have been found in Northwest Florida. This is a fish hook made from bone. And then a deer bone here was used as a punch or an awl, used to punch leather or fabrics, or this was probably a bobcat claw, and sometimes they were used for decoration, but they were also used as tools. So those are some of the things we might find during this time period that I'm talking about. Now, one of the other things that we would find a bit later, around 2500 BC or so, is starting to see crude pottery. And this is a piece of that. One of the ways that we can tell when the pottery was made, there's a couple of different ways. One is by the design that's on it, if there is a design on it. The other way we can tell is by what the Indians mixed in with the clay in order to make it stay together, or to make it so that when they put it on a fire, to dry it out and fire it, it wouldn't blow apart. Which it sometimes did. But this is the earliest type of pottery. It's called fiber tempered, and it's got mashed up palmetto fibers and also Spanish moss in it. It doesn't stay together real well, especially after 4,000 years, But this was found on Choctawhatchee Bay. This was found down on Elliott's Point in Fort Walton.
What part of the palmetto?
What part of? Well,
stems or the leaves?
I've seen them strip the stems and you soak them then. So usually the stems, I think, one of the things we were lucky enough to find a few years ago on a survey in Fort Walton was a nice pot made of, it was fiber tempered, so several thousand years old. And this is it when we first started to uncover it. You can see that it's in really bad shape, lots of sand in there. It was a nightmare trying to get it out. A nice tree root had grown through it, which is usually the case. You can see the roots sticking up there. We did open up an area around it to see if we could find anything else that went along with it. But there was some trash and some other stuff, but basically this was a whole pot. And it was upside down. It was inverted. This would have been the bottom of it. We've already taken some of it off there. And so you have things like this preserved really well around Choctawhatchee Bay. And actually this is one of it's in really bad shape, and probably won't ever be able to put it back together. But it means an awful lot to the people who are trying to figure out where the Native Americans were around the bay and when, too, and also what they did for a living. This is represents a little structure of some sort, probably a little house of some kind that wasn't used for very long. This was in the Fort Walton landing, and you can see that the date that I have here would be 90 or so BC, plus or minus a few years. Radiocarbon dating, which is how we got this date, radiocarbon dating only gives you a range of dates. You know, unfortunately, it doesn't give you July 12th, 1942. And we can narrow this down to about 120 years, and that's actually not bad, considering some of the other statistical measurements that you get as you go further back in time. Then that range gets larger, gets longer. So, but this is a piece of a structure that is in the Fort Walton landing. We excavated this part of it, but we also left part of it in there too, and so some of it is preserved. And if you can see the little circles, they have shell in them here. These dark areas, this was actually, people were using this before they came in and put in the structure. This was a hearth or fireplace that they had used. So when they came in and built this structure, they put posts right down through the edge of the hearth. And so that's one of the ways that we know in archaeology what comes first, by looking at how things got in the ground. So we know that that was here first, and then those two posts were put in when they built the structure. This is an example of a pot that was found over 100 years ago around Alligator Bayou, so very close by. And these are some of the designs from 8200 to 500 that you would have found on a lot of the pots. And you can see that this one has a very intricate design. And I noticed that out in the museum there's a nice display that has some wooden paddles that were carved with the designs. And they would take those wooden paddles and then slap them into the wet clay. And that's how these are made. Now from this time period, there's over 300 in the southeast designs that have been identified. And sometimes we can even see if there's a little flaw in the wood from the paddle. You can trace that thing through 3 states, because sometimes they traded the pots, but sometimes they traded the paddles. And there are people who do research like this and have been able to find the same paddle use in Georgia and Florida and in Alabama. So extensive trade network. Population's also increasing a lot at this point. And that would be the same time period that I showed you the structure from. So AD 200, there's others actually in the Fort Walton Landing too. They really like that spot. Real nice now too, right? I could live there myself. It's beautiful. And there were people living there for thousands of years, long before the Temple Mound was there as well. This is an example of some of the shell tools that you find during the same time period. These are shell beads. These are shell, they might have been used as tools sometimes, but this is the inside whorl of a whelk shell or a conch shell. And they also used them as decoration and as pins to put together clothing. So those were used for a lot of different things. This is also shell. These were used sometimes as ornaments. Sometimes they were very elaborately carved. We don't find a lot of that everywhere in Northwest Florida, the carving. We do in other places. But these are shell beads, and then this is a close-up of some of those little shell beads. So you have these little tiny shell beads that you have to make a stone tool small enough to drill a hole in a little shell bead. And I'm glad somebody else got to do that, because if I had to make a stone tool that size, it would not exist. We would never have had any of those. So you can really think of these people not only as doing these things as part of their everyday social life. Some of this is done so that they can subsist, so that they can fish, so that they can hunt and those sorts of things. But they were also great artisans. And I'm sure not everybody could do this. I'm sure at this point there were some specialists in here who did a better job. You might make your own pot, you know, just for everyday cooking, but if you have one of the more elaborate ones, I think that it took a specialist probably to make those. A little bit later on, this is a picture of the Temple Mound, but, which is later, but from 500 AD to 1100 AD, a lot of area around the Temple Mound was occupied by a culture that archaeologists call Weed Island culture. This would have meant nothing to the people who lived back then. It's a name, usually named at the first site where we recognize some different type of archaeological culture, and in this case down on the Weed Island on the Florida Gulf Coast. It would have meant nothing to them. It's just a way for us to divide it up. It means that we see something different about either before or after them, about the way that they lived. Either they were only fishing and gathering wild foods, or a little later on they started to plant some foods. Large population around Chattahoochee Bay in particular. During this time period, there is a site everywhere. There's a little bit of fresh water flowing out into this bay. It's absolutely amazing. And there were specialists from this time period who built pottery that today it would take an expert to do. And one of those is this very famous one that's at the Fort Walton Temple Mound. From a site called the Buck Mound that was across the road there. It is a funerary urn, and it is gorgeous, and if you haven't seen it, I suggest you go down. It's very impressive, very impressive. And now we come to a time period where I'm going to talk a little bit more about the specific people that were living around here, and that's a time period that archaeologists call Mississippi period. In the southeast, it dates from around 900 AD to about 1700, and actually that's sort of what the Spanish saw when they first settled Florida, is they saw what archaeologists call Mississippi culture to some degree. In Northwest Florida, it starts a little bit later. The Weed Island culture persists for a few more hundred years. Rather than the Mississippi period. And it was named, the first research, or the best research in the beginning, was along the Mississippi River. The largest site during this time period is on the Mississippi River across from St. Louis. This is a conch shell. And these can be found as far north as Michigan. And of course, they don't have conch shells in Michigan. They had to come usually from the Gulf Coast. And so there was a trade network that went all the way from Florida up into Michigan. You find them at this very large site outside of St. Louis. There's a lot of carved shell like this. And so the people of Florida had something that other people in the interior wanted. And so there was a lot of trade back and forth to get these things. Now this is a pretty big conch shell actually for it's about this big. This one is. This particular one is from a site in Georgia, North Georgia, called Etowah. But they occur in Georgia, Alabama, in some places in Florida, all the way up into I think the furthest north is Michigan. Yeah.
If let's say that you were Indian in Florida, wanted to trade up around, like you said, St. Louis, what do you suppose? Would they just follow trails up? I don't think they'd be going on the river, right? Flow would be too fast. What would they do? Trade up there, then somehow get a big raft or a boat and come down the Mississippi, do you suppose?
Well, they would have used probably a combination of all those things. They certainly did use water travel whenever they could. That was the easiest way. But somebody from the Gulf Coast probably just didn't load up the conchs and say, I got to run up to Michigan and sell these things. It's probably a network where it might go 2 or 3 different places, just like middlemen today. before it ever gets up there. So they may never meet those people from Michigan. So it might go to Georgia for a while, and somebody might decide that they want to trade it instead of use it. And so they send it on. And so it's not the people physically taking the stuff up there necessarily. It's a whole network, and it's paths, and it's rivers, and it's creeks, and it's along the Sound, also out into the ocean whenever they had to, near shore, but into the ocean when they had to. So it's a combination of all those things. This was drawn by a Frenchman over around St. Augustine in the 1500s, but this was his idea of what the villages of the Timucuan Indians over there by St. Augustine were looking like at the time. He depicted a palisaded village. There are some little round huts. Now, he took a lot of liberties, I'm sure, okay? So it's sort of a long story, but he did give us some idea of the way that, at least that the French were interpreting what they were seeing. This is supposed to be one of those mounds. This was supposed to be a burial mound. This is supposed to be a burial of an important person in a village. And so they would have had mounded up the dirt after they put the person in there. Now, many of these mounds have lots of people in them. Some of them that are flat top, like the Temple Mound, where they have structures on top of them, they may or may not actually have burials in them. But there are others that are specifically made as sort of vertical cemeteries. And that's what they thought this had looked like. Here's one of the largest. Wait a minute, this is the largest. This is Monk's Mound in Cahokia, Illinois, across from St. Louis. And I don't know how tall it is. It's really hard to get some idea of scale. There used to be a like, 3-story house that it dwarfed right here. So it's difficult from this picture, but it is absolutely enormous. And there are more than 200 of these mounds of different types on this particular site. So that's a lot of dirt that they moved with one basket load at a time, right? So it takes a long time to do that. You certainly don't do it in one lifetime. This is just an array of artifacts from that Mississippian time period. When you have, at Cahokia, there are probably thousands of people. And when you have thousands of people in one place like that, you have to have ways of supporting them. You got to have ways of feeding them. One of the ways to do that is through horticulture. And so at places like Cahokia, they were growing corn. Later on across the southeast, at some of these big mound centers, like one up in Birmingham called Moundville, they were growing corn, beans, squash, and that allowed some specialization in the community, but they still went out and gathered wild foods. They still hunted. They still fished. And all of those things that they had been doing before, it's just they added some agriculture. And so when you do that, then you can have these people who are artisans, and you can support them and support the trade to get these shells up here. This was found in North Georgia on a sheet of copper. So copper had been, there's copper in North Georgia, but apparently they didn't know that. And so they traded that in from Michigan. And today we know there is copper there. These are made from stone. This is called a monolithic axe, and it's about this big. It's about that long. It's very heavy, carved from one piece of stone. And these are statues made from marble from around my hometown. That's why I always show them. I'm originally from North Georgia, from a place called Etowah. And it's also hard to get an idea of scale. They stand about this high. They stand over knee high. Each one of them do. They were dumped into a burial and excavated many, many years ago, back in the 50s. And they were ceremoniously dumped into a burial where there were no human remains when the archaeologists took a look in there. And so it may be that maybe they were made because they didn't have the bodies of these two important people. One's a woman and one's a man. And they dumped them in there instead. It could be that they also came from a structure that we called a charnel house, which is sort of a burial house. And these statues may have been guarding it. There's a lot of thought. But these are also made from stone, found locally, but not made from anything that we would see as local stone. So this is just a small example of some of the artifacts from the Southeast that are found all around during the time period. Now, as we move back toward the Gulf, back to the Gulf Coast, around 1100 AD, we start to see some changes in the way that people are living, and also changes in the pottery that they're making. And we see this in several different places, which I'll show you a map in a minute. But I wanted to show you an example of a pot that was made. This one was found over in Pensacola. It was probably made late, probably closer to 17 AD than 1100 AD. But it looks like a bird. It's called an effigy pot. You see all sorts of animals depicted on pots from this time period. But one of the things that makes this particular type of pottery, which we call Pensacola series pottery, one of the things that makes it unique is that they start to use crushed up shell in it to temper it. And that happens in most of the Southeast during the Mississippi period, but not all. But you do start to see that coming down from central Alabama and down into Mobile, in other places to the west, but also then coming over in Pensacola and moving a little bit to the east from here too. The other part of this that you see that's always tied together when archaeologists are talking about it is called Fort Walton culture. Fort Walton, there's a lot of similarities in the way the people lived, for sure, especially along the coast. But they made their pottery, and they had effigy vessels, very elaborate effigy vessels as well. But they made their pottery crushed up with crushed up stone or with just sand, and sometimes a combination of both. Okay, so that's the way, one of the ways, the designs sometimes are different too. That's one of the ways we can tell the difference between the two. Now, the center of production for pottery, for the Pensacola series pottery, is not Pensacola. And the center for Fort Walton pottery series production is not Fort Walton, which is very confusing to everybody. The reason that it's like this is because in the 1940s, a very smart man, an archaeologist named Gordon Willey, came through here, and he was the first one to identify these types of pottery and these cultures that go along with them. And so, first place he saw this series with the shell tempering, Pensacola. First place he saw Fort Walton with the sand and the grit tempering, Fort Walton. So he named them that way. Now, years later, we find out that there are larger ceremonial centers associated with these particular pottery types that are not located anywhere close to Fort Walton or Pensacola. So, welcome to our world of confusion. This is a Fort Walton series pot. Got nice crushed sand in it, and it's unique to Fort Walton series, and also late in the time period to Pensacola. They start to make it that looks the same. It's called a six-sided bowl, and they only occur in the Fort Walton area. So this is a very unique pot that you're looking at here. This one is at the Indian Temple Mound.
Norma, you know, it occurs to me when I look at that pot that would almost be appropriate for somebody's table or display in our age.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I could see that on my dinner table with some food on it or something.
Yeah, you wouldn't really want this on your dinner table, but yeah, these are beautiful.
Well, I mean, if it was all, if it wasn't cracked and all.
Right. Well, the other reason you don't want that is because normally when you see whole pots like this, normally, not always, but normally, these are from old collections that have been donated to the museum a long time ago. And most of these that are this elaborate, this well made, there's another feature that this little hole in the middle here means that it came from a cemetery, an Indian burial site. Yeah, so that's why. And there's a little bit of, they did this on purpose. They put a hole in it. They made these beautiful things and then they put a hole in it on purpose. And there's a couple of thoughts as to why. I have heard Native American people say that it's to release these would have had food in them when they put them in the burials too. Was to help release the spirit of the dead person, is to make a hole in the pot so that the spirit could pass through. The other thing that I've heard is that these are specially made for burials, so they don't want people to use them in the village on their table. And so if you put a hole in them, then they're really no longer functional. Sometimes the holes are huge, but they're purposely drilled in there. So that is. Most of those pots that you see like that and like this are coming from a burial at some point. Okay, this is generally the region that I'm going to be talking about for Pensacola and Fort Walton culture areas. And you can see it goes all the way from Tallahassee all the way to Mobile, and more specifically, this is the largest center of Pensacola series pottery or Pensacola culture associated with it. It's a site at the head of Mobile Bay called Bottle Creek. And so the pottery, and then over here, this is the largest area for Fort Walton production, and that's over near Tallahassee. The largest mound center over there is called Lake Jackson Mound. And so these would be the center for production for this pottery, or for the ideas for this pottery, maybe not all of the pottery itself. They made a lot of local pottery themselves. They weren't always just trading this, but these are where the ideas radiated from. And you can sort of look at this, it sort of looks like I'm always going from north to south, which is a tendency for archaeologists to do that anyway, but it's really an interaction sphere. So, you know, they're coming down here, or their ideas are coming down here, and then going back up. At some point, they actually have a lot of contact with each other. So it's a lot of interaction. It's not static at all. But this is the general region where we find that Pensacola pottery, and with Bottle Creek being the center. Lake Jackson, also Letchworth Mounds over here near Tallahassee. This would be Fort Walton. Through time, what happens is you start seeing this earlier. This is the first place you start seeing Fort Walton and Pensacola. Through time, what you see is that each type pottery spreads east and west, and at some point overlaps, so that the region that you see in here, by the time the Spanish got here, we were making Pensacola series and Fort Walton. So there was a blending of it. And you'll see right here that this is, this area that I've highlighted is Pensacola Bay, to some degree Perdido, but Choctawhatchee Bay and then St. Andrew as well. So this area, like today, we got to be different. Got to be a little different than some of these other big centers in the southeast. Got to do our own thing. This is on the Tensaw River at the mouth of Mobile Bay, up where Bottle Creek is, going up to the site. This is the mound grouping. This is the largest one here that you see. It's wooded. Most of it's actually either owned by the state or private. I think most of it now is owned by the state. But you can see there were a lot of people living in there at one time. It is definitely a swamp now. I don't know how swampy it was then, but it's definitely a swamp. And this is a group going up to the mound to give you some idea of the approach to the top of the mound. You can see how high up it was there. You can also see that it was deer season when they went in here, right? have no fear from the bears, just from the deer hunters, right? This is at Lake Jackson Mounds outside of Tallahassee, and this is another mound grouping, and so there are a lot of them there. This is one of the larger ones. You can see a person right there, so you can kind of get some idea of how big that is. And this here is on the website. It's a state park, so you can go and take a look at the website. And these are reconstructions of some wooden, I think they're wooden masks that they have done, that they have in the museum there. Okay, if you look at this time period from Florida, we have on Pensacola Bay 160 sites, 151 from Choctawhatchee and 112 from St. Andrew, and I'm sure that we don't have a lot of them yet recorded, and hopefully we can get a lot of that done before development completely takes them over. But on Eglin Air Force Base, we know a lot about the types of sites that are there because it is federal property, and they have to do archaeology. They have to do a lot. They have to know what they have. And so we do tend to know more about those pieces of property. Also some federal property on St. Andrew Bay, and so we do know a little bit about some of the ones there. These are some of the sites recorded from that time period that you see there all around. One of the earlier ones that we have good radiocarbon dates from is called Sheephead Bayou, and it's around from the 1300s. Now, one of the ways that when I look at trying to prove that my theory of our three little bay systems being different, one of the things I have to do for my colleagues is to present them with some data. And so what I did is look at sites from each one of those and look at the time periods that we had carbon dates for in there and see how much through time, how much of the shell-tempered Pensacola was there or how much of the sand-tempered Fort Walton was there, right? And what I did is say, what are the percentages there? In a place like St. Andrew, which is further away from the Bottle Creek Center, the 1300s, 16% only Pensacola, and 84% Fort Walton. So early on, we can see that there's just a little bit of the shell-tempered stuff there. In Choctawhatchee Bay, I took a look at them to do the same thing. Now this is the Temple Mound. This is the largest mound associated with this time period on the Gulf Coast. So in that 3 bay area, this is the largest. And there really aren't a lot of mounds. Up in the southeast during the Mississippi period, they're everywhere. They're just all over the place. Here, not so much, and this is the biggest one. This is Eglin Air Force Base, going to be familiar to a lot of you, but there's a couple of sites down here. If you look at an average of all the pottery on Eglin, if you just sort of lump it all together, then you'll see that it's about 65% Pensacola. So there's a lot of shell-tempered stuff in there. You have to break it down by site or by region in order to figure out if my theory holds up that there was less shell-tempered early and then more later. Choctawhatchee Bay is sort of right in the middle of that, though, and so I would not be surprised at some point to see it just about half and half. As a matter of fact, most of the pottery that we see comes from the Temple Mound itself is actually Pensacola series and not Fort Walton, also lending for more confusion. But if you look at a couple of sites, and these are on Choctawhatchee Bay, if you look early, several sites, 1200 to 1400, you'll see no Pensacola at one site, all Fort Walton. Here's one that doesn't quite fit the mold, and I'm not sure why. There is a later component here, and that may be what the problem is. But this is one that's sort of out of the ordinary. It's 60% and 40. When you look later, from 14 to 1600, you'll see 60% Pensacola and less Fort Walton, 14. And then as you go through time, 83% and 17%. So the shell-tempered pottery is increasing through time around Choctawhatchee Bay. This is one of the sites that I looked at, which is, this is at the Temple Mound. This is an early one from 1300s. You can see that that holds true too. It's 85% Fort Walton. And this is made of bone too.
Can I ask you? So happens that I'm kind of a handyman, okay? But if I were to go ahead and try to drill like the beads that you showed, I would have difficulty doing that these days. I mean, I'd have to maybe send for a diamond drill, you know, in order to get through that. It's like going through floor tile.
Yeah.
Do you have any kind of idea, would you have any idea what material that they use in order to, for instance, make the holes in the beads?
There's a couple of different, that depends on the time period too. But they did use wood, they did use bone, and bone is pretty hard, you know. So depending on the type of bone that you, like a deer long bone is very hard. A deer antler is even harder. You can chip, they chip stone with a deer antler, so it's very hard. So they could drill it with that. One of the things that we see depending on the time period are those tiny little drills made of stone, and they can be absolutely tiny, tiny, tiny. So small, in fact, that we've had to measure them under a microscope to get a good measurement on them. And those were specifically made for drilling holes in things for beads and stuff like that. And what they're made of, you can even get a soft enough stone that you can make a stone bead by using those little drills. So they're very efficient. You know, I would bleed to death, but they're very efficient for people who know how to make them and use them. So this is just an example of some of the pottery that also comes from around Choctawhatchee Bay, one with an unusual design that I'll show you later. Some of this stuff here, when I was doing archaeology in Georgia, this would have been very familiar to me, and I wouldn't have thought about it being down here in Florida. But it does, after a while, get down here. And so these are things that you would find in central Georgia. And so the ideas are being passed along from that area as well. One of the things that we can tell too by looking at food remains, and a lot of us, you know, if you've seen archaeologists work, you think we're measuring minutiae, and you know, most of the time we are. But one of the things we can tell from looking at what kind of shell is there, or and other things, is sometimes we can see what's going on with the natural environment as well. At certain time periods, and actually a couple of times around Choctawhatchee Bay, the oysters seem to disappear, and all we have left are these little razor clams, little rangia clams. And so sometimes we can tell what was happening with Choctawhatchee Bay by the archaeology, by the presence or absence of oyster. These little shells, right, the little clam shells, they like fresh water. We know that several times over the last few hundred years, Choctawhatchee Bay probably silted in, and a lot more fresh water came in. The oysters disappeared, and these little guys took over. And so the Indians were using what they had. Now we get to Pensacola, a rather large bay system. But if we look at one of the early sites, you can see this is one of those shell-tempered Pensacola series sites. But this looks, if you didn't know any better, you'd think this pot came right down from the big Moundville site in central Alabama. A lot of influence coming down the bay. This is a big celt, a ceremonial axe, basically, that would have been found in a burial made from greenstone up in the Appalachians that was in that site on Pensacola Bay. Now, this is more on Perdido. It's sort of between Pensacola Bay and Perdido. So, and it's also an early time period, and so I would expect not to see a lot of the sand-tempered Fort Walton, and also but to see the shell-tempered, and that's what we do see. And all of these designs had been found at that one particular site that you see so that's holding true pretty good. This is a later site on East Bay, and it is about half and half. It shows half Fort Walton and half Pensacola, sort of. And then a later site that I have good data from is a site called the Naval Live Oak Cemetery over in Gulf Breeze. The cemetery was excavated by an amateur, and then some salvage was done by Bill Lazarus of the Fort Walton Temple Mound Museum later on. The university now has on loan the collection from the amateur excavations. We do have some provenience information, but some of it is not as specific as we would like. And so, and we're working on that to try and get some more information. But the array of pottery coming from this site is absolutely spectacular. And one of the things that is very striking is that as you go through time, and even moving west over into Mobile, you start to see more of that Fort Walton pottery. So you're getting less and less shell-tempered and more of the Fort Walton. And this is a Fort Walton. These are pots. They look like gourds, and they're meant to look like gourds. Now here's one of those six-sided bowls that I told you about that only occurs in the Northwest Florida area and in Fort Walton culture. This is a little bit different because at the Naval Live Oak Cemetery they like their shell tempering, so they decided, well, we'll just make this design and we'll crush up some shell and put it in there just to confuse the archaeologists. So we call it Fort Walton in size, but we don't really know what to call it. This whole cemetery is sort of a mystery. And there's others too that are very similar. Choctawhatchee Bay. Don't know so much about St. Andrews at this time period. We don't have any of those really late sites. But this is a good example of how they're taking two different technologies and sort of putting them together. This is another example of the intricate designs that you can get from them. This is all of this is going to be pretty much from the Naval Live Oak Cemetery. Now, there's also a lot of interaction back and forth that we can see in the pottery designs themselves. And sometimes it might be people going back and forth. This is from the Naval Live Oak Cemetery. This is from the Johnson site in Walton County. The design is the same. The manufacturer's a little different and the preservation's obviously better over here. But these are very, very similar in design. So these people are having a lot of contact with each other. This one in particular really proves it. This is from the Naval Live Oak Cemetery. This is a very unusual design, and everybody I show it to says, what is that? You know, this is all my colleagues. So we really don't have this worked out. Obviously it represents waves, so you know, maybe some Native American from somewhere came down to enjoy the beach and they were impressed by the, you know, North Georgia, and they were impressed by the waves. So they put this design on it. This is from the Johnson site, Choctawhatchee Bay, and the design could have been made by the same artist. And it is absolutely, absolutely unique in that way. Others, later stuff that we have in the Naval Live Oak Cemetery, we have some engraved copper. This actually probably was a Thunderbird of some sort that was carved. It's just in bad shape. But that's one of the ways that we know that this site, even though we don't have good radiocarbon dates from the site, we know it's very late. And there's another reason that we know it's very late is because there are Spanish beads, 16th century, which would mean around the time of Hernando de Soto, or maybe even earlier, and also Tristan de Luna. And so we do find those in the cemetery as burial goods. And one poor unfortunate Native American who was buried with this. This is a piece of lead shot, and so it was a bullet. We aren't able really to ascertain if he was really killed by that because of the way it was collected, but maybe one day we'll be able to figure that out. So obviously the Spanish were here when you see an artifact like that as well. Okay, so in our effort to be different here in Northwest Florida, we've taken some of the ideas from these people over here around Tallahassee, some from over here in Mobile, and then further up those big rivers too. So really, these three little bay systems have a lot more in common with each other, even the way the people live. We don't find a lot of corn. People were not growing a lot of corn, I don't think, here around the bays. Probably a little, and they were probably trading some too. But I don't think they were growing a lot. Whereas people up here, they were growing a lot. They were growing quite a bit. And especially the further up the rivers you get. But we do have other things in common too. One of those is a lower population. Generally, the populations are going to be a lot lower than up at the bigger centers. But even as you get closer over to Mobile Bay, the population is probably bigger. So we had less population. Now we had trade networks, and obviously because the goods come and go, and we can see them archaeologically. But one thing that we don't have are rivers that go very far into the interior. That's something that these three bays have in common. And even though the Escambia River goes up and it's part of the Conecuh in South Alabama, it's not like the Mississippi, it's not like the Chattahoochee. If you go up the Apalachicola, you can go all the way up to my hometown. If you started down here and went up the Chattahoochee and up into North Georgia, you're on the same river. We don't have rivers that do that, that go that far. And so that may have been one thing that kept the population down, kept the migration down. Obviously, socially, they had a need to trade with people and to get these goods. So it was very, very important to them. It just wasn't all about collecting food. Of course, you got to have food, and you got to have a family for people to survive. But other things were important to them too. And this trade network was one of them. So maybe that's why there was so much interaction from these three bay systems up into the interior. Maybe that trade network was that important to them. And I think that's all that I have. And if anybody would like to ask some questions, I'd be glad to take some. Yes, sir.
Would it be safe to assume that to the west of the areas that you showed, there's also Indian tribes along the coast there?
Yeah, they're pretty much all along. It's just that we start especially to the west of, say the west of Mobile Bay, as you keep going west, that pottery type just disappears from it. It doesn't extend all that far over there. And that's true to the east too.
So then the Indians were all over the place.
Oh yeah, they were everywhere. They were everywhere. Yeah.
What eventually happened to these groups of people?
Some of them became groups later on that we would names we would recognize. People like the Appalachee. One of the things that we do know, it's hard when you look back into prehistory, especially with the disruption of the Spanish coming in here, and all the groups split apart and then reformed, and so they had bits and pieces of all other groups from all over North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, all of those places just sort of consolidated. A lot of those groups we can't tell who they were historically. A group like the Appalachee, who were around Tallahassee, we actually can see that their ancestors made Fort Walton pottery. So sometimes we can see that, sometimes we can't. So we really don't necessarily know who made the Pensacola especially. Yes, sir.
What do we know about these Indians based on the earliest Spanish encounters? What we've learned from the earliest Spanish encounters?
There weren't that many. The Spanish, of course, hoped for big Indian towns and big populations that were growing a lot of corn and growing beans, not because they wanted the Indians to be healthy. You know, they wanted it so that they could have that stuff for their soldiers, for their army. And they just didn't find it. They didn't find anything like Mexico. But even when Soto landed in 1539 and went up into North Georgia, he did see some pretty big populations up there. They were able to get some corn and stuff like that. 20 years later, when Tristan da Luna came through the same region in 1559, those populations had probably been decimated by disease. There weren't very many at all. He did see a few Indians growing corn probably on the Escambia River, but not much. So it was depopulated pretty fast.
What about organization or interaction between tribes?
During that,
thinking, How did they live? How did they organize themselves?
There was a loose, the idea of the tribe, like a Seminole or Creek or those, that began with a European construct. That's not the way they started out when Europeans first came here. They might have loose affiliations with other villages, but usually their loyalty first lied in their village. Now, there were powerful chiefs around the southeast that had Indians giving them corn, so they had some sort of an alliance with them, sometimes whether they liked it or not. But they did have social relationships, and sometimes over pretty large areas. They would intermarry and those sorts of things. But that consolidation of one big Creek tribe, that is European construct and not something that they would have recognized before, and nor did they want particularly. But that's just the way that the Europeans thought that they should be dealt with. Yeah. Yes?
A few weeks ago in this very room, we heard a gentleman speak about this depopulation issue, and he said that the population of Florida, per se, went from perhaps 500,000 to 500. Does that go along with what you know about after the Spanish arrived and the diseases and so on?
Well, both of those seem a little bit extreme to me, but it's hard to put a number. There certainly were whole groups that were completely wiped out by disease, or between disease and the Spanish. Also, the Spanish disrupted normal alliances between the Indians, and so they ended up a lot of times also fighting each other, which was common for them to do, but it became more life-threatening after the Spanish got here. So that I don't know about those particular numbers, but yeah, when in 1539 Hernando de Soto did take his pilot actually came into Pensacola waiting on Soto, who never came, but he took some Indians with him. He captured them and he took them back to Cuba. He came back year after year waiting on Soto. He'd come back to Pensacola Bay, and he used those people as interpreters. And these people actually came back with Tristan de Luna in 1559, and I think he let them go, if I recall correctly. But you know, there was a pretty healthy population, or at least a population around Pensacola Bay in 1539 and 41 to 41. In 1559, there wasn't. So it didn't take very long. Yes, got one back here.
The Appalachian Indians,
Mm-hmm.
are they in Georgia too?
No, they're mostly Florida. Maybe a little bit up over what we know now as the Georgia line, but mostly between the Osceola and Ochlockonee rivers, and then down to the coast. But their main settlement area was right around Tallahassee there.